three numbers changed everything. I thought I knew about North American trade, $2.8 billion, 847,000 tons, and 72 hours. I need to tell you about the moment I realized we weren't just witnessing a trade dispute. We were watching the systematic dismantling of American economic assumptions by our closest neighbor. And the most shocking part, Trump's administration walked straight into it. At 11:42 a.m. Eastern on a Tuesday morning in March 2025, I was reviewing aluminum price data when my assistant rushed into my Chicago office. The numbers on her screen didn't make sense initially. Canadian aluminum exports to the United States had dropped 73% overnight, not gradually over months, overnight. But here's what made my blood run cold. Those same 847,000 tons of aluminum weren't sitting in warehouses. They were already moving to China, Germany, and South Korea at prices 15% below what American manufacturers had been paying. Canada hadn't just retaliated against Trump's tariffs. They'd executed the most sophisticated economic chess move I've witnessed in 4 decades of studying trade policy. Let me explain what actually happened, because the version you heard in the media missed the most important part. When the Trump administration imposed those aluminum tariffs in February, they assumed Canada would absorb the pain and keep shipping south. After all, where else could they go? America was their largest customer, their most integrated partner, their economic lifeline. That assumption revealed something terrifying about how little Washington understood modern supply chains. Canada's trade ministry had spent 18 months quietly building alternative partnerships. While Trump tweeted about trade wars being easy to win, Canadian officials were signing long-term contracts with Asian buyers, securing shipping agreements, and establishing new banking relationships. They saw this coming long before we did. The execution was surgical. On Monday, Canadian aluminum producers were fulfilling American contracts. By Thursday, those same producers had redirected their entire output to buyers who offered better prices without the political volatility. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. Within 72 hours, American aluminum prices didn't just rise by the tariff amount. They spiked 34% as manufacturers suddenly found themselves competing for a shrinking supply pool. I watched this unfold from my office, making frantic calls to contacts at major auto manufacturers. The conversations were identical. Supply chains were seizing up, delivery schedules were collapsing, just-in-time manufacturing was becoming just-in-case hoarding. Ford's procurement director told me something I'll never forget. We've got assembly lines that might shut down next month because we can't source aluminum at any price. Our Canadian suppliers aren't even returning our calls. This wasn't theoretical economic modeling. This was operational catastrophe hitting America's industrial heartland in real time. What made Canada's strategy so brilliant was its timing. They struck during the height of American manufacturing confidence. Auto production was strong, construction was booming, demand for aluminum was at record highs. That's when Canada pulled the rug out. Within weeks, the ripple effects were cascading through the economy. Construction projects faced cost overruns. Appliance manufacturers raised prices. Even beverage companies struggled as aluminum can costs doubled. But Canada's masterstroke wasn't just redirecting aluminum. They'd also secured agreements with alternative suppliers for everything they imported from America. Soybeans from Brazil, machinery from Germany, energy technology from Norway. They built an entire economic ecosystem that excluded the United States. I realized we were witnessing something unprecedented, a middle power completely outmaneuvering a superpower through pure strategic planning. Trump's response confirmed everything I feared about his administration's economic competence. Rather than acknowledging the miscalculation, they doubled down. More tariffs, more threats, more tweets about unfair Canadian practices. They never understood that Canada wasn't being unfair. Canada was being rational. By June 2025, the damage was undeniable. American aluminum-dependent industries had lost $2.8 billion in the first quarter alone. Meanwhile, Canadian aluminum producers were posting record profits from their new Asian partnerships. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the financial loss. American manufacturers learned they couldn't rely on their government's trade policy. Uncertainty became the new normal. Companies started building redundancy into their supply chains. They diversified sourcing. They reduced dependence on American-based production. These weren't ideological decisions. They were survival strategies. What Canada taught the world was simple but revolutionary. America's economic threats only work if you can't find better alternatives. And in 2025, alternatives existed everywhere. China offered long-term contracts without political conditions. The European Union provided stable partnerships without democracy lectures. Even Mexico started questioning whether NAFTA integration was worth the volatility. The demonstration effect spread faster than anyone predicted. Within months, other countries were studying Canada's playbook. How do you achieve economic independence from an unpredictable partner? Canada had provided the template. But here's what really terrified me as an economist. Canada's success didn't come from superior technology or natural advantages. It came from superior planning and political stability. While America lurched from crisis to crisis, Canada quietly built institutional capacity. They invested in trade diversification. They strengthened diplomatic relationships. They prepared for exactly this scenario. When the moment came, they executed flawlessly. I kept thinking about a conversation I'd had with a Canadian trade official in 2024. He told me something that seemed insignificant at the time. We're planning for the possibility that our largest trading partner becomes unreliable. I thought he was being overly cautious. Turns out he was being prophetic. The most damaging part wasn't losing Canadian aluminum. It was losing Canadian trust. Trust once broken takes decades to rebuild. And Canada had learned that American promises could evaporate overnight. By late 2025, the transformation was complete. Canada had successfully pivoted their economy away from American dependence. They were selling resources to Asia, buying technology from Europe, and coordinating policies with countries that offered predictability. Meanwhile, American manufacturers faced permanently higher input costs, uncertain supply chains, and reduced competitiveness in global markets. Trump had promised to make America great again through strength and threats. Instead, he'd made Canada independent through competence and preparation. The lesson was clear. In an interconnected world, intelligence beats intimidation. Strategy trumps swagger, and preparation always defeats improvisation. Canada had outsmarted America, not through any single brilliant move, but through systematic thinking while their neighbor engaged in economic vandalism. As I write this today, aluminum prices in the United States remain 28% higher than global averages. Canadian producers are thriving in their new markets, and American manufacturers continue struggling with supply chain disruptions that began with one disastrous trade policy decision. The irony is devastating. A policy designed to strengthen American manufacturing has permanently weakened it. Canada, meanwhile, discovered they didn't need America as much as America needed them. That's how a middle power outplays a superpower, not through confrontation, but through competence. Standing in my office reviewing these numbers 18 months later, I'm struck by how preventable this disaster was. All it would have required was understanding that in modern economics, cooperation beats coercion. But Trump never learned that lesson. And by the time the damage became visible, Canada had already moved on. The most sophisticated economic chess move in modern history was complete. Canada had won without America even realizing a game was being played. Trump never saw it coming because he was too busy fighting the last war to notice the next one had already begun. But there's a darker layer to this story that I haven't told you yet. Something that reveals how completely Washington misunderstood the game being played. 3 weeks after Canada's aluminum pivot, I received a call from a Treasury official I'd known for years. His voice was shaking. "Raghuram, we've got a problem. It's not just aluminum anymore." The data he shared was staggering. Canada had quietly triggered something economists call alliance cascade failure. When one reliable partner demonstrates you can't be trusted, others start hedging their bets. Mexico began diversifying their energy exports. Instead of sending 80% of their oil north, they started shipping to Asia. Brazilian soybean farmers, watching Canadian success, renegotiated their American contracts to include political volatility clauses. Even Britain, America's most loyal ally, started questioning trade agreements. A Bank of England official told me, "If Canada can't rely on American consistency, why should we?" This wasn't coordination. This was rational fear spreading through America's entire economic network. I witnessed the psychological transformation firsthand during a Federal Reserve meeting in September. Officials who had spent careers assuming American economic dominance were suddenly asking questions they'd never imagined. What if our threats stop working? The answer was unfolding in real time. American economic leverage was evaporating not through military defeat but through credibility collapse. Canada had exposed something fundamental. American power depended on partners believing America was indispensable. Once that belief cracked, alternatives became attractive. By October, the numbers told a devastating story. U.S. trade relationships had deteriorated across 17 countries, not through formal protests or dramatic declarations, but through quiet diversification away from American dependence. What made Canada's strategy so destructive was its replicability. Every country watching realized they could build alternative partnerships if they planned properly. Canada had provided the blueprint for economic independence from an unreliable hegemon. The final blow came in November when China announced new trade partnerships with 12 countries that had traditionally been American allies. The common factor? All had watched Canada successfully pivot away from American economic control. China's trade minister made the subtext explicit. Reliable partnerships require reliable partners. We offer predictability that others cannot. Standing in my office today, reviewing 20 months of data since Canada's masterstroke, I'm witnessing something historians will study for decades. Not the collapse of American power, but its transformation from inevitable to optional. Countries aren't choosing America's enemies, they're choosing America's alternatives. And Canada showed them those alternatives work better than dependence on an unpredictable giant. Trump promised to make America respected through fear. Instead, he made America relevant through incompetence. Canada's quiet revolution proved that intelligence, preparation, and strategic patience could defeat the world's most powerful economy. The lesson echoes through every chancellery and central bank. When empires become unreliable, they stop being empires. Canada didn't just outsmart America, they ended American economic supremacy in North America. And they did it so skillfully that Trump never understood he'd lost until the game was already over. What haunts me most is how easily this could have been prevented. All it required was basic economic literacy and diplomatic competence. Instead, we got tariff tantrums and Twitter threats. I keep thinking about my conversation with Justin Trudeau's economic advisor in January 2024, 11 months before the aluminum crisis. She told me something that seemed like polite diplomatic language at the time. We're exploring options for economic resilience. I thought she meant diversifying exports by 5 to 10%. She meant building an entirely new economic architecture that excluded the United States. The intelligence failure was complete. While American officials assumed Canadian dependence was permanent, Canadian strategists were systematically dismantling that dependence. They played a longer game than we knew existed. The most devastating revelation came during a private dinner in December with former Mexican trade officials. One laughed bitterly and said, "Canada gave us the courage to say no. If they could escape American economic control, why couldn't we?" That's when I realized Canada's true achievement. They hadn't just solved their own problem, they'd inspired a hemisphere-wide rebellion against American economic dominance. Mexico, Chile, Brazil, even Colombia started questioning why they needed American approval for their trade decisions. The psychological transformation was irreversible. Countries that had spent decades accepting American economic lectures suddenly discovered they had alternatives. And those alternatives often offered better terms without political conditions. Trump's legacy isn't the deals he made or broke, it's the trust he destroyed and can never rebuild. Canada taught the world that American economic power was conditional, not inevitable. Once that lesson spread, American influence began its irreversible decline. Today, as I review the latest trade data showing continued American isolation, I'm reminded of what my professor told me decades ago: empires don't fall to armies. They fall to accountants calculating better deals elsewhere. Canada provided those calculations. The rest of the world did the math. American exceptionalism died not with military defeat, but with economic irrelevance. And Canada, polite, predictable Canada, delivered the killing blow with spreadsheets instead of swords.